Hello everyone and welcome to this video on a topic that is very important to me because it influences and inspires my work, and my work in a big part addresses this issue, which is the issue of religious trauma syndrome. Beyond my own work with this, I believe that it is an issue that influences the whole of our global community and the way in which we live together today. So what I will do in this video is explain what religious trauma syndrome is, how it is seen in today's world in its most acute and problematic form, I'd say, and then take it one step further and really show that there is such a thing as transgenerational and karmic religious trauma syndrome as well, and how I believe that the whole of humanity suffers from the consequences of this transgenerational religious trauma syndrome to some degree. Sometimes this is in a conscious way, most often it's a subconscious, cellular and energetic programming that exists within every one of us. And if we want to be free, sovereign, independent people on a spiritual path, it is our responsibility to address this and to deconstruct this toxic structure, limitation and programming within our being. So, very important topic. So religious trauma syndrome, the official definition of it is: religious trauma syndrome is a term used to describe a set of psychological and emotional symptoms that result from harmful religious experiences, especially those involving authoritarian or high control religious environments. RTS typically arises when individuals leave or are forced out of rigid or high demand religious systems, or exposed to teachings that instill fear, shame, or guilt, or experience abuse. So this can be physical, emotional, sexual, or spiritual abuse within a religious or spiritual setting. So of course, what we think of straight away are examples of people within cult settings. People enrolled in a cult or children born within a cult setting who experience physical, sexual, emotional abuse within that setting, and whose stories we know because they were able to break free and get out of those settings, which very often then requires years of therapy to address that trauma. Very often those people are traumatized a second time when they enter normal society and they are confronted with the gap between themselves and the rest of society. And very often those people as well are traumatized additionally through the fact that making the decision to leave the cult setting or the religious setting, they are then ostracized and cut off from all of their social connections and their social ties. So all the family, the friends that they had within that environment, cut them off. So they are cast out, which generates additional trauma, of course. Milder forms of trauma, but still, are people who choose to leave certain spiritual or religious settings and who then are no longer allowed to have any contact with the people within those settings. People who experience severe social pressure from the religious group or from the spiritual group to behave in a certain way, to speak in a certain way, to adhere to certain values and a certain lifestyle. People who feel extremely judged because of their lifestyle through the prism of the spiritual community or the religious community. So those are all things that can constitute a form of abuse. And of course, in our world today, as we live in the era of the apocalypse is the revelation and the era of truth, We have many, many, many examples of this kind of abuse. So many gurus have fallen off of their pedestal because of stories of sexual abuse, of emotional abuse. We have had all the issues within the religious institutions, stories of child abuse, stories of nuns being abused inside of the religious institution where they thought to be safe, where they thought to be able to experience their religious vocation, their spiritual vocation in a pure way. So the trauma is worsened and reinforced, of course, because of the connection of spirituality or religion to the abuse. So not only does it create a distrust in the adult, in the person inflicting the abuse, but it also creates a real sense of shame and guilt towards God and towards the divine, and a separation of the person experiencing the abuse with the divine and with God. So it's a very problematic issue, of course, and this is a form that is most well known within our world today. This form of religious trauma syndrome created by actual abuse within cult settings, spiritual settings, religious settings. And in my own life story, this has played a role indirectly, because my parents grew up in a classical religious education, as so many people had in Europe. I grew up in Belgium, so did my parents. They went to Catholic school, where nuns were providing the education and the classes to the children, nuns and priests. And they have so many stories of children being beaten, children being cast out, humiliated in front of the whole class, and these nuns and priests, supposedly representatives of God, of the divine, being mean and vile and just really aggressive and inhuman, I would say, in their behavior. Beyond that, they told me stories of going to Mass, and Mass for them being really a horrible experience. Of the purpose of these Masses was to instill fear in the people, fear of God, but beyond that, fear of going against their government, fear of speaking out against their parents, fear of speaking out against any authority figure. So this abuse goes much, much further than fear of going against a religious institution. It became a fear of any kind of authority or authoritarian figure. It was really a culture of fear and a culture of shame and guilt, which I feel many people can recognize. They made the choice, even though our whole family is Catholic or was Catholic, to not baptize me or my brothers, to give us a secular education and to allow us to make our own choices in life, which was brave, because it did get them a lot of commentary and a lot of questioning from their family and their friends. Their reason was to give us the freedom, but more than that, they were so heavily traumatized themselves by this type of education and environment that they grew up in, that they didn't want to inflict this upon us. I would say that I received secondary consequences of their untreated religious trauma. The secondary consequences for me and for my brothers were an extreme distrust of any kind of religious or spiritual environment, person, or even structure, institution, which is something that I have had to move beyond to find my connection to the spiritual and my connection to God in my own sovereign, independent way. So, and here we start going into transgenerational religious trauma syndrome, because obviously I hadn't had any direct religious trauma. I had no connection to any kind of spiritual or religious community, but I was born into a society where religion had played a crucial, very important role for many, many generations. Hundreds of years of people were part of these religious structures, and it's not so long ago that church and state separated. So for many, many formative years of our Western civilization, the church and the state were one. And the kind of structure and thought pattern, behavioral patterns as well, that created the structure of the institution of the church also created the structure of the institution of our democracy, of our society, of our way of living. So this structure, which to a large extent determines our relationship to our inner sovereignty, our own individual and sovereign connection to the divine, but also our relationship to any kind of structure or figure of authority, is still very heavily influenced by this transgenerational religious trauma syndrome. And I think I can clarify this if we go into some of the symptoms or consequences of religious trauma syndrome. So their heavy, severe religious trauma syndrome really creates symptoms very similar to PTSD. Other symptoms are difficulty of trusting others, placing excessive boundaries and paranoia, difficulty of trusting your own judgment, fear of judgment, and fear of being excluded if we don't adhere to the common norm. And I think we've had an example of this in our very recent history, which is the whole COVID crisis. Most people felt that if they didn't think in a certain way, they didn't behave in a certain way, they would be excluded from society for thinking differently or making different choices to the majority of people. That kind of thinking and that kind of behavior is a trauma response. And that behavior is informed, amongst others, by religious trauma syndrome that is transgenerational. It is this patterning that says, if I go against what an authority figure says I should think or say or how I should behave, I will be excluded, or worse, my life, my safety is in danger. So you can start to see how this is influencing all of us really in our day-to-day behavior and decision making. Other symptoms are problems with establishing boundaries, so excessive boundaries, but also problems with having boundaries, confusion or difficulty in making decisions, anxiety or panic attacks, shame and guilt, negative self-beliefs, perfectionism or black and white thinking, loss of meaning and loneliness. So I think many of us can maybe recognize many of those symptoms of having experienced them in our lives, or maybe experiencing them right at this moment. And a lot of it comes from patterning within ourselves, within our energetic structure, heavily determined by religious trauma or societal trauma. Some examples of harmful religious dynamics are this dynamic of exclusion or ostracism if you don't agree with the beliefs or with the way of life, authoritarian leadership that discourages autonomy or critical thinking, very clear within a cult setting or a toxic religious setting, and we can also see that within our societal structure today and with how many of our governments act today. If we have a voice that goes against the norm or against the status quo, we run the risk of being ostracized. Now, transgenerational religious trauma syndrome is this subconscious patterning that was created through centuries and millennia of toxic religious structure and institutions. Because the religious structures in our world today are inherently patriarchal, the lifestyle of anyone who is not a male, and very often a white male, heterosexual, married with children, is seen as problematic. And that programming is subconsciously present within each of us, where even without wanting to, women will have inferiority complexes. Gay people, people from the LGBTQ community will feel inferior because of this transgenerational programming of what is right and what is wrong. The religious structures were the authority on moral values, and those moral values, even if intellectually we don't believe in them anymore today, or we have evolved beyond what was present or prevalent or true hundreds of years ago, because our ancestors experienced these and very often were traumatized by them, this trauma of our ancestors is still present within our genetic structure, within our cellular structure, within our DNA. So we need to uproot this. What we often forget is that we are not just an individual. Our current incarnation is the fruit of a whole tree of life, of which all of our transgenerational family line, paternal line, maternal line, throughout centuries of human history is part, and we carry all that heritage, all that baggage within us. So it is our responsibility to clear that out of our structure, to make sure that future generations don't have to deal with that trauma syndrome anymore. And as I showed in the example of my own parents, it is not because we are no longer part of a religious institution or a spiritual institution that we no longer suffer from the consequences of this abuse, because it has determined our connection to figures or voices of authority and the fear to go against those institutions. The fear of being an individual in a collective. The fear of having a voice that is different from the voice of the masses. This trauma can be through parents who shame their children because of their sexuality, because of their life choices, because of their lifestyle. It can be a whole society so embedded within religious life that shames people who make choices that go against what the authoritarian structure requires. And then beyond the transgenerational religious trauma, all of us also have spiritual scar tissue from karmic religious trauma, which is situations of abuse or memories of abuse from different lifetimes, which can be religious persecution, can be the Inquisition, can be the witch hunts. It can be simply being ostracized in societies of the past because of the lifestyle choices we made. It can be women being forced into nunneries, men being forced to be priests. Can be believing something that wasn't the main state religion at that time and being persecuted for that. All of it creating the patterning within us that being outside of the norm is dangerous. It's a template of obedience for the sake of safety that is embedded within our energetic, genetic, and physical structures, and that can override the template of sovereignty and freedom, and very often does. So how does that play into my work with the energy of Mary Magdalene and Yeshua and the teaching that I share, the path of the Magdalene? Well, it's revolutionized my own path, of course, when Mary Magdalene came on my path because of everything I just shared. Of course, it was hard for my parents to accept that I chose a path, that I was called to a path. It's a real vocation for me to follow the path of the Magdalene and to teach it in this world. It was hard for them to accept because they perceive Mary Magdalene as being a religious figure. Of course she is not. Mary Magdalene existed just like Yeshua. They existed before the birth of the Catholic Church. They never intended for an institution like the Catholic Church to be founded based on their teachings. They had a faith that was pure and that promoted sovereignty and a direct connection to God and to the divine. But still, because of their programming, it was really hard for them to accept. And it is what I see so often in men and women today. When they hear about Mary Magdalene, they are reluctant to go there, either because they come from a religious setting and they have a very warped vision and idea about Mary Magdalene, or if they come from a secular setting, they are afraid that it's a dogmatic Catholic teaching, which it is not. Mary Magdalene stood for a lifestyle and values that are almost directly opposed to what the Catholic Church is sharing today. She was a prophet. She was also a Messiah. She was a female saint. She was sharing the teachings as much as Yeshua was sharing them. She is a teacher of sovereignty, of a direct connection to God, and of so many of the values that we consider to be Christic values today. They shared those values together, her and Yeshua. The work with Mary Magdalene and the work with religious trauma syndrome really influences my work today, because I see how people get triggered when we start to work with the rosary, and how this inner structure of religious trauma is opened and released and deconstructed through the reclaiming of Mary Magdalene as a voice for the divine feminine, as a sovereign female feminine Christ voice, through the work with the rosary beads and the rosary prayer, not as a dogmatic Catholic symbol. And by the way, I just want to interject here that I don't have any problem with people following a religious path, as long as it leaves the freedom for other people to experience their spiritual path as they feel called to. I have walked this path long enough to know that a true connection to God is not a question of which religion you choose or which spiritual path you walk. It's a question of openness of heart and of integrity. So what I do with the work of the Path of the Magdalene and the introduction of the Holy Rosary is that we decolonize our minds, our spiritual structure, and even our DNA of these trauma structures enforced by religious, institutional, and societal abuse. So it's a real path of liberation and of sovereignty through a reclaiming of the purity of these teachings and their true origins that predate by far even Yeshua and Mary Magdalene's lifetime, as a real red thread throughout the course of human history, all the way back to the first primordial fire of our human existence, the umbilical cord that connects us to the Divine Mother. That is really what these teachings are about. And what it does is that it puts us back on a path of freedom, not a freedom through selfishness or harshness of boundaries or needing to isolate ourselves, but a freedom that comes from the fact of feeling an inner authority, of having an inner sword of integrity present within us. A freedom that is never selfish, that always takes into account the highest good of all. A freedom that comes from having a lived and physical experience of the divine. A freedom that comes from radical responsibility for our choices and our actions. So that's why this work is so important to me and so dear to my heart. And I can guarantee you, if you feel super triggered by walking into a church, by hearing or seeing someone pray, by some of the religious symbols like the rosary beads, like a statue of Mary or an image of Mary Magdalene, there is religious trauma present within you. And I can guarantee you that if you leave it unaddressed, it will continue to affect your state of being, your levels of anxiety, your way of building relationships with other people, the way in which you make your choices. So it is really in your own best interest to address this and to not run away from it. We are no longer in an era where we can allow ourselves to bypass certain things. It is really important to face everything, the slightest contraction that arises within us, and free ourselves of all those contractions. And this is a big one. This is a big one that is present within all of us, and that is present within our global society, and that is holding us hostage, that is keeping many people imprisoned within structures of limitation, within structures of guilt and shame and fear. So you doing the work to free yourself of this is creating more space and openness for other people to walk this same path as well.